Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This is episode 78. We're going to be talking about The Road, the novel by Cormac McCarthy from 2006. One quick caveat. We apologize for the audio quality. We are normally based around the idea that people should have conversations in person on very expensive microphones. And because of COVID, we are doing this remotely over Zoom. So sorry about the audio quality. I'd like to introduce our guest for this episode. He was on two previous episodes. He was on episode 66 of Scary Thoughts, where we discussed Joker, and episode 55, when we talked about Naked Lunch. He is the author of Reading the Way of Things Towards a New Technology of Making Sense on Zero Books. Daniel Coffeen. Hey, Daniel.
Woohoo!
Hi.
Hey.
Welcome back.
Thank you kindly. I'm honored.
And I don't want to reduce you to one book, but...
there is only one book. That's all I am.
Well, yeah. You are working on something new, right? Tell us you are.
Yeah. I am. You got a sliver of it, through the YouTube. I used videos as a way to begin organizing my thoughts. Fact is, I began writing this thing in the fall and wrote about 50, 60 pages. And then COVID happened and I had to start from scratch because it's such a good example, and to ignore it, I began the book talking about what it is to buy eggs, and using that as the example, and then realized, that life and death and medical arguments are a much better way to talk about arguments. So It kind of stopped me in my tracks. So I had to start from scratch.
The stakes of everything are definitely very different.
Yeah. I predict you might make more hay from the videos than you will the book. It just feels like video format is such a more natural way to philosophize and talk and get ideas across. Like you get all the inflections and enthusiasms in parts of your voice, and you don't have to be a square with your citations and whatnot.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm becoming more and more enamored of it. And, one of the luxuries of having left the academy is I actually never cite a motherfucking thing. Like, I always hated that. I probably shouldn't say this, but when I, now these days, when I have like a quote, I want to quote something from Nietzsche, I just do it by memory. Like, really, I got to go look it up. Who cares? The way I remember is probably more interesting anyway.
Yeah, if you read older books, it's kind of like that a little bit. Like I was just reading some fucking turgid, hard to read old ass book, and the guy was just just quoting something off the top of his head. And I was like, oh, that's kind of an interesting, and then I went and looked at the quote, and the quote was kind of different. I was like, oh, this doesn't really matter too much. It was actually in I think it might have been in Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception. He was just like quoting something that he kind of remembered, and it's like, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to prove how much you remember the thing, or are you trying to express an idea?
Exactly.
Yeah,
no, exactly. Yeah. What difference does it make?
Yeah, I just there's that guy that does the podcast Martyr Made, Daryl Cooper, and there was like a weird little dust up with some other another, we'll just call him a philosopher, who was like complaining about how what he was doing as a podcaster wasn't real academic writing, because what the guy who was talking about did was, write thick books with tons of citations. I was like, man, that just feels like a really old fogey way of looking at this shit.
Oh, yeah, totally. I had this great realization, I always have since I left academia, that was 2008, 2009, I've always had a project. I'm always writing something. And I always had, when Zero published this book, I'd already written it. It was already on my desktop, right? I always had a project I was working on. But then at some point, because of my kid and all that, I started writing essays. And I always saw my blog as this sort of extraneous thing, this extra thing. And then I suddenly realized, that's basically my life's work, right? There's thousands of pages there, traversing an incredible variety of tones and subject matter. I was like, that's my thing. A book is so banal compared to my blog.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a big jump because, of course, like you're saying, people just obviously always seems lesser for some reason, right? Because it hasn't been vetted by some peer review of schnooks. Yeah, but I realized like my blog's still on Blogspot because I'm too lazy to, I've had that thing for like 11 years or something, right?
There's some really like oddly heavy hitting blog spots still out there doing really, really heavy work. I mean, it's kind of an interesting site, I guess.
See, I actually love exact quotations. I actually love the practice of it. However, for my own life, I don't remember who said what. You know, like all those years I spent studying philosophy, I could not tell you the difference between Kierkegaard and Heidegger and Nietzsche. I don't know who said what. All I know is where I ended up after reading them all. And that to me was more important anyway. So I kind of don't give a shit.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like, do I know a lot about Nietzsche? Well, I've read a lot of him. I couldn't tell you anything he said because I don't remember, but he certainly changed my perception on things. And I'll just go about my merry way, you know, with this new perspective. And that's how I engage with those texts, not with precision by any means.
It's a luxury. I mean, I'll say, you know, when I was in academia writing my dissertation, I love the super close readings. You know, I mean, I was always doing my own translations of things and talking about other people's translations and why something. I love that hyper detailed thing, but it's so pedantic. And it definitely had a kind of fetishy, perverse delight for me.
I feel like that stuff's like going to the gym. Or like training, like you get like really like you work out all your shit, and then the video or the event or even like the debate, if you're that kind of person, you know, that's where all that shit, all that, you know, training and horsepower like finally gets to play out.
Yeah, exactly. Because the actual exposition of that level of sort of pedantic exposition is just finally, I don't know who it interests, and that's why no one really wants to read academic writing, right? It's so lost in the weeds. And to Mark's point, I'd rather see what you became, you know, because you read that or in the act of reading that, than, you know, your very fine, nuanced, you know, translation of a particular word. Even though that offers a lot of pleasure, and I really did find it kind of erotic in its way, but my eroticism has changed. My fetishes have changed. Now I just like making shit up.
Great.
Well, speaking of erotic fetishes, The Road.
Okay.
Road. All right.
Let's give a warning that we're going to be discussing some spoilers about the book and the movie. And yeah, I mean, I think that as a very easy segue from what we were just saying, I feel like this book for me, you know, I've read it twice now, is such a texture. And again, you know, I just, for a laugh, read the Wikipedia entry about it today. And it was like, oh yeah, that did happen. Oh yeah, and then there was that part. And I'd kind of forgotten a lot of the incidents because I felt my reading of it was just such post-apocalyptic wallpaper where not a lot happens. It's just so grim and so sad that, you know, I don't want to talk about the movie too much, but the movie actually sort of like peppers it with smiles and little glimmers of humor and love that is completely vacant, completely absent from the book.
Can I say so reading the book, and we'll talk about the film in a second, but the book is, you know, I have a lot of problems with it fundamentally. In terms of what it tries to execute, it sort of executes perfectly. I question a little bit the value of it, of what it's trying to execute. But I have to say, reading it, I kept thinking about this musician I know in San Francisco who makes this sort of ambient, dark music. These sort of, you know,
sounds interesting.
Buckethead. It's Buckethead.
Fucking listen to Despairer and reading this book were very similar to me. Just relentless.
I'm sorry, you were listening to my music while you read this book.
I heard it in my head. I couldn't shake it. Like I was like, this book is so absolutely univocal in its despair, right? It is just, it's not gonna wink at you. There's no sort of Baroque Beatlesy aside or bridge. You know, it is just the drone of despair.
Yeah.
Like, this is a father-son road trip black metal album is what this is. It's just a straight blast beat the whole way through. Yeah.
Yep.
But it did remind me of some of your work, Mark, in particular that record.
I'll take it. Thank you. Wow. Thank you. Let's just get to it. What's your criticism of it? Is that it is so relentless, or?
No, you know, so thanks to you guys and Chad in particular. So this is my second Cormac McCarthy. So I read Blood Meridian and then this. And what I'm so sort of, what I both admire and am sort of repulsed by in these two books at least, is that he deploys a vision. That's what's sort of impressive, right? He clearly has a vision like a Welbeck, like a Burroughs, right? Like the great writers who are just, they have a vision of life and their books are the proffering of that, the world making of that. But his world is so, I just did this rant on Twitter about this. I can't trust something that has no humor. I mean, his whole reading of the world is this sort of violence and indifference, of this terrible violence and indifference and cruelty of the universe, right? That religion runs through it, but that religion tries to contain and explain and fails. That there is this other relentless drive. And I don't know how one can deploy a vision of the world that is absent humor. I don't understand that. And I have two problems with that. One, it makes me question his vision. It's like, really? Like, I get that this is one note in the world, and I'm down with the fact that there's despair, and it's sort of a kind of despair, right? That sort of precedes, supersedes any kind of cultural reckoning, despite its best efforts. But really, man, don't you ever see the comedy of life? And as a craft, I think that humor is the most complicated thing to do. And I think he takes an easy path. I think it's easy to be relentlessly despairing.
Yeah, this is certainly his least funny book, and that's spoiled for choice, really. Like, a lot of his books are not exactly laugh riots. But I think, like Blood Meridian, his book Blood Meridian is my all-time favorite book. And I think in that book, you can make a case that there is a certain amount of like dark cowboy humor. Like, I could definitely see the Coen brothers, for example, making really funny scenes with that book. And the judge himself, as terrifying and evil as he is, I think, a comical character in a lot of ways. And then this book is just so absent any of that shit. And then, and I wonder if it's a little bit of like his mental state when he was writing it, because he was like, I think he was in like 74 when he finished this book up, and he is out there slinging dick late in his golden years. Like, so he has a child that's like 8 or 9 years old. And so this book, what he told Oprah anyway, was that this book is sort of about, a father coming to terms with the fact that he's not going to live to be able to guide his child through. And that seems like a very, very like heavy idea, but it also seems like if you were just this heavy-handed father trying to keep your child alive, like, what the fuck is the point? It doesn't make any sense. And that's one of the things I actually kind of like. A lot of people don't like the addition of the Charlize Theron mother scenes in John Hillcoat's version of The Road, but I think they also do sort of. I don't want to say they lighten it at all, but it gives it at least like a glimpse away from the ashen sky, the black in the sky. The word blackened is the most common word in the book.
Yeah, I think it does lighten it, and I think at its expense. Upon rewatching the movie, I actually sort of felt like it was a compromise that I didn't like. I love any excuse to see Charlize Theron have an interesting part, and what she was doing with that part I thought was really fascinating. But I don't need a love interest in this story. Yeah. I don't need him to be wistful. And I know that's perhaps slightly argumentative of what Daniel you're saying, but
I couldn't agree more. I found the movie, I mean, as a kind of relevance aside, I will say I a lot of things I do not like about that movie, but I can't even tell you how hard I was crying. That fundamental pain of a father dying and trying to keep his son alive and afraid of holding his dead son in his arms is so primal to me as a kind of Jewish drug-addled father that I really was hysterical when I was watching the film.
Yeah,
I'm interested to hear you say that, because one of the reasons why I really wanted to have you on specifically to talk about this book is just watching your Instagram and the way you photograph and talk about your son. And you're living in this sort of like, you're living in this kind of like apocalyptic moment, and you guys are out there like doing art projects and having fun and kind of mixing it up in the world. And it's like, so I thought about that relationship. I mean, I don't know anything about it other than what you show on Instagram, but sure. That was kind of what was interesting to me about having you talk about this. And I'm glad to hear. I don't know, if glad's the right word, but like that you had an emotional response to the film is interesting to me. Like the moment when he pushes his wife's wedding ring to the edge of the highway that they're above, and it's after he's thrown her picture away and the wallet away. That's the scene that really got me in this movie. Like that, just the idea of like that, and how long will that ring sit there, or will it move? And like no one will remember it. No one will remember the life they had. Like that shit is terrifying to me and haunting to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I actually have a hard time. I almost cursed you guys and almost said I couldn't do this, because things that intense around father son, I just have a hard time with, because I just, I am an emotional guy, especially when it comes to the kid. But the movie, with all the Charlize Theron, adds this sort of bourgeois layer, right? That McCarthy never allows for, doesn't care about, right? That the father-son relationship in the book, I don't believe is a bourgeois relationship. I think it's life itself and the ability of it to repeat itself and the affect of that, right? So while the book's intense, to me, it doesn't have that sentimentality that the movie has. And that's why the movie adds in all the Charlize Theron scenes, right? It's it's what is the mother? Where is the mother? The loss of the family unit. And, I think at some point it casts the father in this kind of, again, this sort of bourgeois role, where the book, to McCarthy's sort of credit, he's interested in these other modes, right? That don't give a fuck. He invokes religion constantly, but it's the failure of religion to account for it. What he likes about religion is the affect of God's wrath, his mercilessness, the violence.
I think that one thing that the Charlize Theron character does introduce that I actually appreciate is what is missing from the book. There is plenty of despair and there's plenty of giving up, but the last two scenes with Charlize Theron introduce someone who can't take it and who just absolutely can't take it anymore, and whose decision-making process to detach from all the obligations of parenthood, that she just has to relent. And I find that akin to what you were saying, Daniel, about this emotional moment about, the confrontation of losing your son and saying goodbye and things like that, is someone going through a process of completely rejecting maternal instinct, which is as primal as anything can be in a human, and it just isn't enough. That primal...
That's great. Yeah.
That primal instinct, the world has become so awful that what makes you human is done. And you can't even look your child in the eye to say goodbye. And so you just walk out into the darkness. There are things about the movie that I like and things I don't like. And I thought it Hollywoodized something really, really fantastically grim and despairing. But I think that moment for me was actually kind of amazing. And it's something that wasn't explored in the book too much, although this book explores a lot of layers of nihilism and hopelessness. It didn't touch that one quite.
I actually love that. And it makes me wish that the movie was about her.
Oh, sure.
Because that decision is in a way more interesting.
Right.
And
instead we follow the hero, basically. We don't...
Right.
We don't follow the person who couldn't handle it.
Well, he's a drive, right? I mean, that's, I think, what McCarthy's fundamentally interested, right? Are these sort of drives, again, that precede, exceed, supersede our cultural institutions, and the ways we can phrase things. I mean, just reading these two books, I to be honest, I have no desire to read any more. The guy can write, but I have no desire to. He's deploying a vision, and it's not that interesting a vision, but that vision is a human. Right? It is this kind of inhuman becoming, right? So that the father's role is a kind of drive as opposed to a character, right? He's not a person, right? He is simply that aspect of life which seeks to keep itself alive, which the mother does not. And the movie really opens up that possibility, and I think is a more interesting decision. But wouldn't sit with McCarthy, who's not interested in those sort of bourgeois decisions, right? He's operating at this sort of level of these profound forces, right? I mean, every fucking sentence in the book, right? I mean, you go choose any sentence in the book, it's the black, dark, fucking decay of it all. And he doesn't have much interest in the sort of bourgeois mechanics, machinations. But I'm with you that I think I would have rather seen that film. And I think if this movie this movie's not terrible. I actually will admit, I quickly read the A.O. Scott review for the Times, and I don't like him as a critic, but what he says is what I felt too, which is the film doesn't actually go all the way to the book's despair, the book's monotone, relentless gray. And it could have done that, right? I feel like somebody else might have been able to do that. It's impressive that it got that far in Hollywood, I've got to say. It is a fucking dark film. It is not a Hollywood blockbuster, despite, Viggo's presence and Charlize Theron's presence. And props to them for really going dark. But it could have gone, I'd rather, I want to see someone else make the film, like Herzog or somebody, just letting it be totally, truly despairing,
Yeah, I like a lot of John Hillcoat's movies. Like he reminds me a little bit of like when Japanese dudes get really into whiskey or rockabilly. Like they like create like a perfect version of that thing. Like that's kind of how he is. Like The Proposition is one of my favorite westerns ever, but I also never want to watch it again. So that's kind of my feeling with this thing. It's like yeah, I saw it. It is heavy. And then I wonder if this movie, if it had like not been an Oprah pick, if it had not won the Pulitzer Prize, if they would have been able to run this thing through Hollywood as it is.
Yeah,
I'm always surprised how much they like him, because he's so writerly. And my favorite thing about him, Cormac McCarthy, is his prose. The guy can write. It's very writerly, which bugs me a little bit. I mean, I can picture him in the Iowa program. I don't know if he went to the Iowa program. I can picture him working through it. I can picture the New Yorker loving him. He pulls a lot of moves that feel very writerly, unlike a lot of the writers I love, like Burroughs. It is imagistic, but his affect is so subtle. And again, it insists so much on the prose. It's why I think like someone like Nabokov, right, who's a true writer, and I know there's been a couple attempts to make Lolita, and they never quite work, although the Adrian Lyne is much better than the Kubrick's, because they insist on the page, they insist on the written word, and what the written word can do over and against what the image can do. The image has all kinds of possibilities and opportunities the written word does not have, and vice versa. But McCarthy strikes me as a fundamental writer. It is writerly, it is of the word, and his rhythm and his pacing are what are to me most impressive.
Yeah.
I don't read many novels. I very rarely trust a novel, but I tore through these two books, which is very rare for me.
Well, McCarthy's the real deal. Like he's a dude who lived in poverty, wrote the books he wanted to write, like was given all the chances to be a bigger guy. Because like when he was writing his like the Border trilogy, like he's had quite a few books turned into films or whatever. But he was just a dude who really sat in the empty room with the typewriter and the cigarettes and the nothing else and let his marriage blow up and all that shit. And I mean, it's pretty cool.
Feels like that. No, I agree. Yeah. I feel like that's why I'm surprised a little bit that Hollywood has sort of glommed onto him, because they seem kind of untranslatable. I mean, can you picture Blood Meridian as a film?
Yeah.
A little.
Like, yeah, a little bit. Like, but my choice of director is Terry Gilliam. Like that's who I want.
Oh, beautiful. Beautiful.
And it's solely for one reason too, which is in the scene in Blood Meridian where the natives are just swarming across the desert and they're wearing like all the crazy shit. Like one of them has a wedding dress and one of them has a conquistador armor. Yeah. And the idea of the conquistador armor really stuck with me because it's so vivid, and it made me immediately think of Terry Gilliam's failed Don Quixote. Totally. And I'm like, man, I'd love for him to have like a redo on this, and he films deserts in kind of an interesting way, I think, and just the surreal death experience of Blood Meridian, I think would just be perfect for him. And then that conquistador armor, like, I guess, one of the things about Cormac McCarthy, it's a little bit of if you just read the books, you're like, man, where does this shit even come from? But if you start digging into it a little bit, you realize he's choosing very historical elements in assembling them. So there's a book called Books Are Made of Books, which is a quote of his, which is something like, the sad truth of it is that books are all made of other books. So like nothing comes from nowhere. He's assembled these things. So the conquistador armor, there was a Native American shaman named Iron Chest who went into battle wearing old ass conquistador armor that he found, and he fought like the Texas Rangers as late as the 1840s. And so there's like all these little details that I'm obsessed with it, so I keep digging for them, but I think it's probably better not to. I think it's better just to be overwhelmed by, I mean, I'm in too deep now. Like I'm reading his like papers and shit like that. Like I'm all about it, but I think it's better to not do that with him.
I would think that to do Blood Meridian properly, and maybe I've only read so much McCarthy, but to do his work properly, I almost think it would be like what happened with spaghetti westerns, that the art of making the perfect American Western movie somehow was really pushed by an Italian vision, that New French Extremity directors and ethos would possibly be the only way to depict the level of raw violence that is contained within Cormac McCarthy's books, because I feel like the translations to screen that I've seen, they all really limit the amount of grotesque horror that is contained in the worlds that he creates. Yeah. Whereas a lot of New French Extremity cinema, at least at its peak, was doing so unflinchingly. And I don't see American filmmakers as being invested in that level of darkness, really.
Oh my God, no. I mean, the Terry Gilliam thing is super interesting. It's a brilliant call. But he would add, and what it would do is turn Blood Meridian, which to me is a far superior book.
Yeah, totally agree.
I agree.
I'll talk about that in a second. But he would turn it in, and you can really see it as a kind of farce, right? As a farce on the level not of against sort of the we generally think of a farce as a put on of human institutions, right? But you can see Blood Meridian as a farce of the human over and against and up against the sort of mercilessness of nature, right? That the book is almost hilarious in its relentless, extreme violence, the madness of the characters. Mm-hmm. And Terry Gilliam would add a dimension that I don't think Cormac McCarthy could even begin to embody, but that adding Terry Gilliam to it would add such I think, a brilliant level of inflection to his sort of, again, one note of despair, one note of biblical scale violence.
Well, if we're gonna go there, why don't we take it one step further and get Tim Burton to do a series with Johnny Depp as the star of each. My God,
the big
it'd be
question
so
for
good.
Blood Meridian. Well, the question for Blood Meridian is who plays the judge. You know, like that is like
Johnny Depp.
Please,
in a wig and a hat.
Now, what you need is Burroughs. You got to resurrect Burroughs for that role. You know.
Yeah. I'd like somebody like I imagine the judge actually looking a little bit like George the Animal Steel did in Ed Wood. Really, like a giant hairless white beast of a man who happens to be able to fiddle and dance.
Similarly would be, what's the guy from Guardians of the Galaxy? The really big guy?
Chris Pratt.
No, twice his weight, twice his size.
Andy Dwyer.
I don't know.
Chris Pratt's character from Parks and Rec. He was twice his size. When he was, the guy that plays Drax.
Yes.
Yeah, Baptiste.
I mean, he's
a wrestler. Yeah.
He's very funny when he wants to be funny, but I'd imagine he could be very, very unyieldingly menacing if he chose to.
I gotta tell you, Chad, I can't shake this Terry Gilliam doing Blood Meridian because I mean, I've had this like conversation with a bunch of people, and in fact, the most consequential conversation I had about it was with this guy who owns Alquin Books in Scottsdale, Arizona, and he's just this 84-year-old genius who is a rare books dealer, and he's been a rare books dealer for for like, I don't know, 60 years or something like that. And I was there on a work trip, and I bought a first edition copy of Blood Meridian
that I couldn't really afford at the time from him. And we had like this crazy long conversation, and it felt like a fully mystical experience, which is why I shelled out the money and probably became so deeply obsessed with it at the time. I mean, I'd liked it before, but like it really kicked into overdrive after that trip. And I really started looking at it as like a personal sacred text a little bit, because I also, I'm constantly thinking about violence, and I love the Old West and, how people got it wrong and got it right in different stories. So yeah, it's important to me. The Road, not so much.
I love that. I love when books do that to people. Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I tore through Blood Meridian when I was on a trip at the dying end of an intense love relationship I had, and we were actually in Taos, and I'm reading this thing. And there were so many things I kind of loved about it. One of the things I love is the visibility of the desert, and I love that they're constantly seeing. It's like, oh, look over on that ridge, fucking 80 miles away. There's a guy on a horse. Right. And as you're driving through and fucking around in that whole region, the visibility of each other, right? The way we come into view and out of view is so different, right? And it introduces different sort of narration, but also different relationships to each other, right? Because you're always in this kind of view that I found poignant at the time.
The part about the vision thing that's so interesting, one of the things I like about McCarthy so much is he has this like almost like a scientific eye, which makes sense because he's at the Santa Fe Institute, and he only wants to talk to geologists and people who do like quantum computing and shit. But there's no interiority in any of his characters, really, in any of his books. Like, so everything you know about them is by observing what they observe, which I think is so slick and such like a really good writer thing to do. And competence is such a thing for him, like fixing the wheel on the shopping cart, or knowing how to make a lamp out of a can and some old ass coffee filter. Like all that stuff is just super cool. And it's one of the things I really like about No Country for Old Men is just, all those characters are sort of like superheroes, and their power is that they're just competent and they pay attention.
So Chad, have you read all of his books or just some, or?
I haven't read the Border trilogy, but everything else I've read. And
how do you feel like The Road compares to those others? Not quality like ranking, but rather what he's deploying with language, his sense of structure, the character. Because Daniel and I only know Blood Meridian aside from this one.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, like Blood Meridian is certainly the high point. Some people make a case for All the Pretty Horses. If you're a little bit more into like a bit more of a classic story, even though it's very McCarthy, it's still a little bit. There's just more characters and more things happen, and it's just a longer story. Yeah. And it seems like this book is real, like just stripping away. It's like if you heard like somebody be like, "I'm going to get back to the real shit, man. I'm going to have acoustic and a suitcase I beat on for a rhythm," like that. That's what this book feels like to me. Yeah. And then, it feels like the most personal in some ways. I mean, I'm just going by what he says, but, it seems to be the most personal. But yeah, it's as the rest of them kind of are. You can feel different influences on different books. Like Sutri, for example, there's a whole book called The Ghosts of Huck Finn, which makes a case that he was heavily inspired by Huckleberry Finn to write that book. And you can see pieces of it, and it's trying to be funny, but I don't think it really is funny.
That's what I was about to ask you. Does he ever deviate? So just knowing these two books, The Blood Meridian and The Road, that deviate in tone, right? So one thought I kept having was thinking about Gabriel Garcia Marquez and the difference between 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera. Where Love in the Time of Cholera is like one note, a beautiful, perfect note, right? And that's the way I read The Road. It's just hitting, if Marquez is hitting like a major A, McCarthy's hitting some kind of minor D or something, right? The whole time, where Blood Meridian, like 100 Years of Solitude, is so Baroque, right? It spins, it spirals, things come around, they move around, they meet up, they form all these different trajectories. And I don't know any other Garcia Marquez. But between the two McCarthy books, again, the tone, I mean, he's so easy to imitate. He's so easy to mock in a way, or because it's just it's that same thing over and over, right? And I'm wondering if he ever tries something different.
I mean, it's just like just applies his skill to like slightly different stories and different story modes a little bit. I mean, this is, to me, this is a genre book. This is a sci-fi apocalypse. And, other books are a little bit more like Raymond Chandler-y, No Country being a good example of that. And there's always the West. There's always the landscape. Have you ever read any of, who's the dude that wrote the Monkey Wrench Gang?
Abbey.
Yeah, Edward Abbey.
Yeah, I read that book. Yeah.
Yeah, to me, like Cormac McCarthy has the same level of landscape appreciation, but without the gonzo humor. Like I think it's kind of fun to read Edward Abbey, especially his desert books, and Cormac McCarthy, because they're, they seem to be a little bit fellow travelers. Like they're old, crusty cowboy type dudes. Like the humor in McCarthy's book is kind of like, have you ever tried to back up a trailer in front of an old man who really knows how to do it?
Yeah.
Like the kind of way that guy is like when the guy goes like, huh, so that's how you're going to do it, huh? It's funny, but it's also not funny because it's so just dry and mean. That, to me, that's the humor that's in all of McCarthy's books.
Yeah, it's funny. I wish I could tap into this humor a little more, because Abby's I love that, the kind of tragic comedy to the failure of the human before the majesty of the desert, right? That he relishes and kind of loves. And he loves that comedy. He loves the failure of the human rather than despairing of it. Where McCarthy just always seems like the human is this sort of afterthought, which you're talking about the interiority of characters. He's not interested in the human. There is no interiority. That's not, we are simply forces. Everything operates on these sort of glacial or cosmic, or I guess they're more terrestrial than they're cosmic, but they're the plotting of PLODDING, of like the earth and rocks, and the human is just another force within that. Right, where he's not as interested in its institutions or the characters or the humor and joy a particular character might take. Right?
Yeah, it's almost too like he just doesn't give a fuck about anything that hasn't been around for like 1,000 years.
Yeah, exactly.
And that includes like human experiences. So the human experience of war and violence has been around forever. So he's interested in it. But like something very modern, like, what to do with statues, I don't think he would care at all about. Like, and that's one of the refreshing things about these books is that none of them are dealing with any sort of like modern phenomenon at all, even though they do play all these like modern games, like not having like, easy punctuation and all that shit. There's just nothing, like it's not postmodern, it's modern, it just feels very primal.
Yeah, well, that's his whole thing. I mean, that's my kind of kvetch against it. It's like, come on, dude. Like, you want to talk? I mean, again, he's clearly a good writer, right? I mean, that's a given, right? So anything I'm saying is built on that, right? But it's like, dude, come on. Like, you want to talk about everything comes down to the ancient violence of the world itself, of the earth, and that human war and violence is simply a continuation of this. Yeah. To not see the comedy in that, like the Coen brothers picked up on the comedy of that.
Yeah, I don't know that they could ever not. I mean, they're so great. I mean, they might be the best directors working. I mean, I don't know. I'd have to defend that a little bit better. But like, in the myth of Sisyphus at the end, you're supposed to imagine Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill with a smile on his face.
Right.
It's like McCarthy goes like, why bother smiling? Like, but then you're like, okay, well, if you're not doing is like a fuck you to those punishing you, what do you got? And I think that's the best line that Charlize Theron's character has in the movie is she's like, surviving isn't enough. And I think that's such a key line, and then the movie, the book does it too, but the movie has a little bit more of the like, they have like this like proto-religion where it's like, oh, will I see you after? I hope so. And then the whole thing with carrying the fire, like sometimes I'm like, oh my God, it's so profound because it's so simple. And it reminds me of this thing Alan Moore said about how all fire is the same fire. Then other times when I hear it come out of that child actor's voice, I'm like, oh, fuck this whole idea. So I don't know. Did you guys have an experience with that?
No, but something that I'm thinking of based on what you guys are saying is that another thing that this book and Blood Meridian are lacking is they're so not libidinal. They're so sexless. There's no desire. And so this primal level at which you guys are articulating, this text to be, it is lacking in a primal, creative sensuality, something like that.
Totally.
You know, and even, I mean, again, I'm referring to the movie, but, you know, the book doesn't even graze it. The movie does have Charlize Theron saying, like, they're going to rape him and kill him, and then they're going to rape me and kill me, and eat me and eat him. You know, it's like mentioned, but at the same time, like most apocalypse narratives, there's the threat of rape or the actuality of it. Whereas in The Road, it is so fucking desperate and hopeless that these cannibals don't even seem to have that. They're not even there to, they're not even going to defile your body. They are just going to murder and eat you. It's just, brutality.
Yeah.
There's not even exploitation left in this landscape.
I feel like there might be a different cut of this out there, because do you remember the scene where the man and the boy are laying down and there's the tribe of men and they're running after the woman and her child and they catch her and then it doesn't show it?
Yeah.
I feel like I saw a version of this where they tear her clothes off. Like, and I'd be curious if there was, I mean, now that like I'm kind of sensitive to edits, you know, and how they're happening in the world and how shitty that is. Like, I wonder if that's a thing, because that would have made, I mean, even as dark as it is, it would have introduced like that libidinal thing into the book or movie. Because I mean, yeah, it's in there. You know, something I wanted to talk about was, and it came up with a conversation with Ashley, who I don't know. I believe Ashley, is it Ashley or Allison?
Oh, you're talking about Allison Holt?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So she had a comment on Instagram, which I thought was really interesting, because I just read Parable of the Sower for the first time, and she had this kind of comment about, like, you know, which I read it in the moment as, yeah, the road's cool and all, but it's completely ripping off Parable of the Sower.
Oh, right. I saw that. Yeah.
You know, at first I was like, okay, well, why am I defensive about this? Am I just like one of these guys who just is ride or die for Cormac McCarthy? I was like, that's kind of a stupid position. Like, let me think about this a little bit more. And then she and I had a DM conversation. I was like, well, where exactly do you think it's like the same? And then I started thinking about how there are a lot of similar things. And I think it has a lot to do with like the source of some of the terrible things, like refugee stories, Trail of Tears type stories. Like anytime like somebody who's fucked goes from one place to another, bad shit happens. So that I think explains it. But then I started thinking about like Parable of the Sower, I think is probably the more popular. Well, I mean, I don't know if it's the more popular novel, but it feels a little bit more satisfying because there's more life in it.
You got to give us some context, Chad.
Like, so people have sex and relationships and enjoy each other in the, you know, and it's also a little bit before everything.
Which books?
Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler.
Oh, okay.
So those books have a little bit more passion, and I think it's a consequence of like what's going on is that the main character is establishing a new religion with a tribe of people. But in The Road, Cormac McCarthy sort of established this weird personal obsession with religion with his child. And it doesn't involve anybody else. And I think the fact that it doesn't involve other people might be one of the things that's keeping it so cloistered instead of being open and human.
Yeah, but he's just not interested in the human. You know,
yeah, he just doesn't give a fuck.
Yeah, exactly. It's just never he's operating at this other level. That seems to me, just reading these two books, that seems to me the vision he's deploying. Right? He's putting words to work at the sort of behest of forces that are pre-human, non-human, inhuman. And the human runs up against it, which is one reason I find his lack of comedy so surprising, because it seems so ripe. So I can see why the Coens would dig that, right? Because they love that. They love the failure of the human in the face of sort of earthly forces, you know?
What did you think about Vigo as the man? Like that decision to have him.
Yeah, I mean, I have an enormous crush on Vigo. I mean, I think he did an incredible job. You know, I think he plays it that's a hard tone to hit, I think, without becoming too sentimental. Mm-hmm. You know, in the book, it's much easier, right? He's really not sentimental at all. But to wear that on your body and wear that in your face and wear that in your intonation is impressive. What do you think? I mean, I love Vigo, and I thought he nailed it.
I think he's great, although I think there is an inherent warmth to him as an actor that I'm comparing the book and the movie
the
movie, but the book does not have a warmth. He constantly has these subtle smiles and this humanity to him that the man in the book doesn't have. And again, that is just that ever so slight Hollywoodness added to this text. But I think that's...
Couldn't agree more. But yeah, the movie seemed like a bourgeois reckoning. And I don't mean bourgeois like in a capitalist sense. I just mean like the family unit, mommy, daddy, me, and all the sentimentality attached to that, which is a move to go. McCarthy's just so relentlessly, it's not that he's anti-bourgeois, it's a-bourgeois. He just has no concern, like Chad was saying about even human interiority, right? Which is again kind of a bourgeois construct, right? The individual. And
Can I talk about something incredibly bourgeois? Part of the choice to do this book for Scary Thoughts has been, we've been focusing especially on very apocalyptic things, sort of reflecting the time we're in with World War Z and SAFE and things like that. But there is a way in which this book in particular resonates with this moment because this is about a pair of our heroes are homeless. They are wandering the endless landscape into oblivion, and we are all the opposite right now. Well, not all. A lot of people are being kicked out of their homes at the moment, but so many of us are trapped in our homes. It's the opposite. We are not being purged from our homes in search of warmth down south. We are all trapped in our homes, unable to go and be out in the world, but we are all still, in a certain sense, lonely. We're all yearning for human contact and unable to get it. But at the same time, I'm totally going off on a subjective tangent. So
I love it.
So, enjoy the ride for a moment. But, I don't know about you guys or anybody listening, but Monique, my wife, and I have been kind of reassessing domestic situation, where things go, what do we need, getting rid of some things, acquiring some things that we've needed, but we didn't realize how much we needed it until we're just sitting in the apartment almost 24 hours a day. And one thing we bought was a better vacuum. We bought a brand new Dyson, and those things are like completely fucking mind-bogglingly magic in their ability to suck up dust. And it was very interesting to be watching that movie and reading the book, picturing this endless landscape of ash, while having this incredibly bourgeois purchase we just made to make this domestic space in the middle of the apocalypse free from dust. And the thing about the Dyson is, you vacuum and you see the dust that you've just pulled out of, you look at a clean carpet and you run the Dyson over it, and then you realize that no, there were like 16 ounces of filth in there that you couldn't even see. Anyway, so it's been a confrontation with dust this week for me.
The Dyson really reveals your animal disgustingness.
Oh, God. I can't imagine if I had a pet, what that would be like. Anyway, yeah, so very, very bourgeois.
Yeah, it's a great call, that sort of, which speaks actually to McCarthy, right? Which is this excavation of interiority, right? Everything's exterior, right? He couldn't really talk about this happening, right? Because this is all interior. This is all what's happening with you were talking, Mark and I were talking about earlier before this all started, right? Like your horniness or your romance or your whatever you're trying to deal with. It's just so not McCarthy, right? He's only interested in the plague itself, right? And the ruin in its wake.
Yeah. You could also, though, see him nerding out a little bit about the performance of the Dyson, because I have one of those vacuums too, and they're fucking awesome.
I have one too, yeah.
Apparently, when he's on set on films, he's like more interested in talking to like the key grip and like whatever fucking weird pocket knife he has, and especially guns. Like, there's a gun person on the set, like that's his guy. There's a really funny Coen Brothers interview where they talk about how they had invited him to the set, and everybody's like on edge, and Josh Brolin is like, oh my God, you're an American icon. Like, I can't wait to meet you. And he just shows up and he's just happy to talk about duck hunting guns with the props guy, and like that's, and I think that's part of the dude's myth. It's so amazing. But Mark, what you were talking about, like this sort of like sitting in this like ambient waiting place, trying to prepare, really reminds me of the scene with the old man that they run into on the road. And what he says, which he says something like, I always knew this was going to happen. And then the man says, well, what did you do? How are you even still alive? He's like, I don't know. He's like, well, what plans did you make? He's like, what kind of plans can you make for something like this? So like, I really like that idea of like, the world doesn't give a fuck about your plans, as evidenced by the bomb shelter that no one was able to go to until they found, like that to me is in the very beginning of the COVID thing. I was like, okay, got to get this ready, because I have a bit of a survival bent, survivalist bent.
A bit.
And then at a point though, I was like, well, what's going to happen? Like if things get really, really bad, am I shooting my way out of Oakland? No fucking way. Like, that's crazy. Like, that's not going to happen. So then I was like, well, what is happening here? It's like, well, I better just hope it fucking holds together. Like, so that's where I've been at. And like, that to me is like kind of like the man at the scenes before Charlize Theron really gives up, is like, he's got the room full of beams and, he's got candles everywhere and he's boarded up the windows and he thinks he can make it. And then she just is like, we're not going to survive another winter here. And like, you can tell she's right because, she's so dark, I guess. But yeah, like one of the things I like about this book is that there is no surviving the zombie apocalypse. There is no, Crubble that you learn how to use with the rest of your Russian stooges. It's just, they're just blacking out. There's no winning.
Well, what's fucking, really troubling is in your moment of questioning about how to prepare for the coronavirus and what's the best way to make it through. Actually, the best answer is to just continue to be good at your job and hope you don't get fired. Like, how's that for living in the age of neoliberal capitalism? Like that's how you're going to get through the apocalypse, is don't get fired.
There's this great, strange reflection of our temporal horizon, right? Like, when this thing first began, are we waiting it out? What does it mean to wait this out? Or there's this, at some point you're like, oh, maybe this is just the way it is. It's like, well, I can go 3 months without this or that, right? But then it's 6 months, then it's a year. At what point, what is your horizon? And I have friends who have businesses, storefront businesses. And they're like, well, am I just waiting? Am I trying to raise enough money for rent to wait for this thing to come back? Or like, yeah, I don't know. It feels a little bit like the Jews in Germany being like, yeah, this will pass.
Yeah.
Like, nope, it's time to fucking bail, break those leases, fire all your employees, get the fuck out. But in the road, his horizon constantly of McCarthy's is always infinite, right? It's always, or at least, there are always there's this whole movement of French historians, right, who introduced geological time into history, right, as opposed to human time. So rather than judging everything or assessing our history by wars and architecture and art, it was by looking at geology. And I feel like that's McCarthy, right? He's a geological historian, right? It's a very different time frame. So the road is at once infinite and going nowhere, but never needed to go anywhere because there's no there to get to, right? And the human is just a speck on it, right? That will come and go, right? And the terrible earth, the blackened earth, will continue in perpetuity, which makes me wonder about the ending. So I was reading the book and then cutting back and forth to the film, which I was pleasantly surprised was free on YouTube. I didn't know how else I'd find it. And I came to the ending of the movie before the ending of the book. And I was like, oh my God, look at this ridiculous ending. Look at this happy ending.
Yep.
And then it turns out that's in the book. And it kind of threw me off. And I would love to hear you guys' take on that, because I was surprised by this sort of, I was wondering if just, as a father, what happens to your son? He imagines his son is taken care of by this sort of benevolent family. And it's the sort of resurrection of the bourgeois at the end. It's a mommy, daddy, me. It's not like a weird clan. It's not a hodgepodge of zombies who will take care of you. It was very much a bourgeois unit. Mommy, daddy, babies,
Yeah, well, he gets dropped right into a family. He basically gets adopted, which is like best case scenario, really.
Yeah.
They're ridiculous. Like the same day, right? Like you don't see him getting ass raped and his arm eaten, or even he could have even fallen into a clan that didn't look bourgeois. It wasn't mommy, daddy. That was like 3 eyeless, toothless guys and this weird woman and a bunch of stragglers. Like, it could have been other things that were more complex. than just this sort of mommy, daddy, me, sort of Oedipal.
Yeah, I'm surprised he wasn't a little bit more opaque with the ending,
Totally.
because No Country for Old Men, you have to reread the chapter where Llewellyn Moss gets shot, because you're like, wait, what fucking happened? And then the Coen brothers like perfectly transfer it to film, because even when you watch the film, you're like, wait, what happened? Did we just lose the protagonist of this film, and it's going to shift like to be the perspective of the villain? And at the very end of, spoiler alert, Blood Meridian, well, I mean, I won't say what happens, but something fucking wild happens, and you don't really know, like, wait, what? And at the end of this, like, we talked about the exteriority and noticing things. The things that the boy notices about the man that comes to basically save him is when he asks him to cover up his father with the blanket, he does it. Like, so he keeps his word. And then the shotgun shells that he has in his bandolier are homemade and, rebuilt, basically, which is like, okay, this is a competent dude. And even the way he kind of talks the kid down from pointing the gun at him is just like best case scenario. But on balance, though, like, I guess it's kind of a Rorschach test a little bit, because it's like, okay, in that world, do you think that family makes it, or do you think that family doesn't make it? So there's sort of the question, but it is definitely a straight up happy ending.
Yeah, it sort of surprised me. It felt so Hollywood to me. So one thing, of course, maybe not of course, but I couldn't help thinking about, especially with the palette of the film, was The Walking Dead. And with The Walking Dead takes a very fundamentally different approach, because The Walking Dead, to me, is about the sort of deterritorialization of all sort of ethical, moral, human structures, and then the attempts to reterritorialization. So it's constantly trying to, there's what happens if we're a dictator? What's a democracy? What if it's these competing dictatorships, right? It keeps redistributing the human in all these different ways that get surprising, in which you end up in a lot of sort of moral quandaries. Where in this, it's the McCarthy thing, right? Throughout the book, I mean, this is one of the things that drove me crazy in the book, to be honest, was, Dad, are they good guys? Yeah, they're good guys. Will we be bad guys? No, we're not bad guys. And there's this sense that there is some profound ethic that can possibly meet the terror of terrestrial cosmic violence, right? And will we eat people? No, we won't eat people. You promise we won't eat people? No, we won't eat people. And this sort of ethical struggle where it feels McCarthy's only recourse there feels to turn to some unbelievable simplicity, as if there's some universal moral about not eating people. It's like, really? Like, it's not more complicated than that. And The Walking Dead, I think, is great at proliferating the complexity of what it means to be ethical once, in the apocalypse, And McCarthy, this book really has this whiff of morality to it, which I found a little disturbing and banal. And it's like, oh, he's trying to save the remnants of what it means to be human, to not eat people. But really? The guys up in the soccer team, the Andes, eating each other, not human? It's beautiful what they did. It's more complex than that.
Even in Anna Lily Amirpour's movie The Bad Batch, there's cannibalism, and like, it seems fairly unnecessary in the film. Like, the characters who are cannibals, like, there are plenty of people who are living in the same environment who are not cannibals, but she starts that film with being pretty like, like, the main character gets her arm and leg eaten, so you're definitely not on the side of the cannibals. But later in the film, there's a scene where that character and one of the cannibals is sitting at a campfire, and he is eating a hand. And the movie slips into this like moral gray area where you're like, does she eat the hand? And by the end of the movie, they're all sitting around eating a rabbit. And so you're like, okay, well, have they made this decision? Like, to me, like, that's a little bit more interesting, because she's like slipperier with the ethical dilemma of when do you eat people? Like the example you gave in the Andes, that's when you do,
It's not, as opposed to like the Levi-Strauss argument, right? That there are these fundamental things, as if there are these fundamental laws. We don't eat people. We don't have incest, right? We don't mate with our sisters. And, that was the whole Levi-Strauss argument, that there are these universal laws of human behavior that are somehow natural And I feel like McCarthy in that book, that's the sort of, to me, was the most disappointing aspect of that book, was this very simplistic black and white. Are we good guys? Are they bad guys? I mean, I can see the father saying that to the son, but it doesn't just, I mean, fuck, I'm a father. I explained, my first thing my kid ever understood was I taught him, was watching any idiotic movie we watch, is it's not just good guys and bad guys. And that's what was so awful about that movie we just watched. I didn't care he was 4 years old. It's what I taught him. Like, we might've enjoyed the movie, but that was an idiotic moment. And that was, to me, a disappointing aspect. And I feel like McCarthy's obsession with the sort of pre, post, or supersessive inhuman is that when he talks about the human, he doesn't really know what to do with it. And so his ethical structure just becomes somehow supposed to be some universal truth. We don't need people. But that's just not that fucking interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what I thought the Walking Dead strikes me as fundamental, where they're very different. The Walking Dead is very much about the human. How does the human organize itself once all our terms of organization are gone, right? Once all the prevailing terms of our discourse, and it deals with it incredibly interesting, right? Because, you know, whatever the big sexy dude with the cowboy hat, you know, never British dude, right? He changes over time, and what counts as ethical behavior, right? It's in flux, and he doesn't always know, and sometimes you just act. Where McCarthy, I feel like if you push him on the questions of human ethics, he doesn't know what to do, right?
Yeah, Oprah kind of presses him on this a little bit, and the reason why I keep talking about Oprah's interview with him is because it's like the only interview with him really out there.
We don't have much to work with.
Yeah, there's not a lot. There's like some Santa Fe Institute like promo reels that he did, but like it's pretty much the longest conversation with anybody. And you know, she straight up asked him like, "Do you believe in God?" You know, there's these themes here, and he says, "Well, it depends on the day you ask me," which is to me like, you know, like I mean that's kind of how I feel, I guess. But at the same time, it does feel dissatisfying to believers and non-believers, which gets into that weird Kierkegaard position where you can have faith without reason or reason without faith.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, playing it down the middle just sort of doesn't, no one likes that, you know? And I don't know if like, it feels almost like upholding like this weird cowboy code that he has running through this totally black metal like environment is the tension that he's trying, but I don't think it's satisfying.
Right. Yeah, I think he's better when he's not dealing with that, right? Like he's better when it's just sort of the terror of the earth, the terror of necessity, simply the mechanics of it. But when when the question of the ethical, the question of behavior comes up, I don't think he really knows what to do. I don't think he has a nuanced answer. I'll say when I reading these two books of his, I feel a lot like a writer I was really into, maybe 30 years ago, which is T.C. Boyle, who's obviously very different than Cormac McCarthy, right? Because everything is this sort of. Have you guys ever read T.C. Boyle?
No, I've not heard that name before.
No, and he was again a very popular writer. And his sentences, I mean, he's a fucking writer. The way Cormac McCarthy's a writer, some of those sentences, I could just read them over and over. I'm like, Jesus, that's just a bizarre construction, so gorgeous, rhythmically. And I felt the way with T.C. Boyle, even though there's a kind of cartoonish nature, right, to these tumbling sentences and this prodigious construction of prose. But for T.C. Boyle, it always ends in the sort of comic failure of the human condition. And there's never any insight. There's no nuance. And I feel like it's about Cormac McCarthy too, where he's this great prosist. He can spin a yarn. And I by no means want to diminish those tasks, right? They're incredible, right? And I take great pleasure in reading both these books. But when I go to the writers I love, like a Burroughs, like a Hunter Thompson, Nabokov, right? There's more insight into the nuance of life, rather than prose deploying a consistent vision that's finally not that interesting. I feel like I'm not going to learn anything really from Cormac McCarthy. It's like, oh yes, the earth is terrible. There's a violence in the fundamental architectonics of the planet. All right, where The Walking Dead is this exploration of how can we organize ourselves? What counts as behavior? What counts as our ethical sort of discourse? Absence any sort of juridical structure we all agree to. I feel finally disappointed in what Cormac McCarthy is giving the world.
Mm.
Yeah, you almost like hope somebody so good and so wise would have some advice for you. I think it's part of it.
Yeah, exactly. Like have some take on something. He never gives me a take where I'm like, oh yeah, look at that. Where reading Burroughs, I'm like, Jesus Christ, he made me reread everything. The way I look at everything is constantly changing based on Burroughs,
His Code of the Johnson is the belief system most necessary right now, in my opinion.
Totally. And I that's my ethics to the core. I used to teach that and the only ethical system I belong to is the code is the Code of the Johnson. Look out for your fellow mate. Don't be a fucking asshole, But I feel like McCarthy doesn't, it's this constant, relentless invocation of these forces that exceed us. And there's something very beautiful about it and something very harrowing about it. And then I'm like, all right, whatever, dude.
Yeah. I think that the Chad, I think you brought up black metal a couple of times. I think there's something fairly, I think that is as good a comparison as one can make, because how do I think about this? Just thinking about how does this post-apocalyptic narrative compared to other post-apocalyptic narratives? And I think that what it does well is it takes this genre of fiction and refines it to its absolute, right? You want to talk about Oblivion? How about a book that has almost no superfluous material? It is just texture and sentence construction around this nihilist, endless, bleak landscape, and you get nothing else. And that is really akin to what black metal and maybe doom metal have done, is that, you start with rock and roll and it's the devil's music, and then it gets a little more intense with, some Rolling Stones and Black Sabbath, and it keeps getting refined to Merciful Fate and Bathory, and then, artists just keep stripping things away from it to make it more aggressive, more nihilist, more less, more Oblivion, more pure. And yes. Then at some point you have black metal and doom metal, which are these total refinements. Well, at least to me, when artists in doom metal and black metal are at their best, to me, are these absolute refinements of how completely Oblivion focused can music be. It's sort of the none more black joke taken to its extreme. And I think that Cormac McCarthy writing this apocalypse narrative is doing the same thing. And, I probably listen to more black metal and doom metal than anything else lately, but I can see how that is incredibly unsatisfying, because compared to something like World War Z, where there's all this adventure and complexity and character building and things like that. And then something like Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents by Octavia Butler, as you brought up before, they are both these books that are full of human interaction and how do people cope and deal and build community. And this book is just stares at that and it's almost like it doesn't see the point. Yes. Yes. And I can also see it as not an exercise quite like it's that trivial, but how minimal, how much like a scorched earth can I make a book about scorched earth? And again, none more. He did it.
Yeah. Yeah, in a way that's definitely my favorite thing about this book, about The Road, is he just hits this one note and fucking sustains it.
Yeah.
Which is why I brought up the ending, because I was like a little surprised by the ending.
Right.
But he really just sustains it. And that is, again, what I find most appealing and finally the least interesting about it, right? Like, to me, the apocalypse would inaugurate such an explosion of possibilities of sort of affective resonance, right? Like, to me, I don't, a band I love is a band called the Beatles. They're a big band out of England in the 60s, right? Who had such a wide-ranging affective sensibility and such a put on, such a play, such a, in a way I could read the Beatles as post-apocalyptic, right? We read them as the opposite. We read them as these, in a way, bourgeois, right? Very like producing from this culture of abundance. But another way to see them is that they're untethered. They're untethered, right? And to me, that's the liberation I get from the Beatles, which is they don't need to be true, right? They don't need an ethic. They don't need to replicate a genre. They're going to jump all over the place. Where for McCarthy, there's an untethering that leaves only one note. And again, what's impressive about that book is the execution of that one note. I mean, he's I hate this word, but he's a master, right? I mean, he can fucking write. And it's just, he hits that fucking note and does not relent. But then I see the Beatles and I can read them as post-apocalyptic. I go, fuck, everything's up for grabs. Let's do all this stuff, right? Let's quote everything that ever has been. Why not, right? From Baroque classical music to punk rock to, I guess Helter Skelter's pre-punk rock, but to musicals, to folk music. If everything's up for grabs, if it's the end of everything, why not explode it, explore it? And McCarthy only has one answer, one note, and he nails it. It's a little bit the way I feel about any hardcore genre band, let's say like a metal band, right? It's just, we do this one thing, as opposed to a band like the Beatles or Ween, right? These bands I love who will jump genre, jump everything. Everything's up for grabs. And I was thinking about the lack of humor in McCarthy, thinking about all the writers I love, all the people super dear to my heart, right? Which is, Philip Roth and William Burroughs and Hunter Thompson and Edward Abbey, and there's such a humor and a put on through it all. The same with the music I love. There's a put on. There's a beauty to My Bloody Valentine, but there's also, to me, it's like, yeah, but you're just one note in my repertoire, right? Yeah, I don't know. That's where I land on this whole McCarthy thing. I get it, and I'm underwhelmed in the end by it. I don't want to shit on your parade there, Chad.
No, I think a 22-year-old me would have been like vociferously enraged. But now I'm just like, yeah, like that. People have different experiences with these things, and even then, I wouldn't say, I probably would not have reread The Road. Well, that's not true. I read it earlier this year just because I was kind of going through all of Cormac McCarthy's books this year. But I don't feel like I need to read it again,
Yeah,
but I will probably continue reading Blood Meridian throughout my life, and then ultimately I was like, I don't know. I like hearing a different opinion on it, to be honest. And I agree with all that stuff, it's just like, where do I order it in my enjoyment?
Right. Yeah. No, the fact is I really did. I tore through these books and I don't read novels. I'm very rarely engaged. And the fact is McCarthy's deploying this vision and he's doing it so thoroughly and so artfully, so craftfully that I enjoy reading it. I deeply. But I still leave him out of my canon, and my canon comes, and that's why I was surprised when you brought up Terry Gilliam, who to me, I think it's spot on, but begins to speak my language, right? There's my language of the put on, my language of the burlesque, and to refer to a genre that's close to some of our hearts, to drag, right? To the performance, the performativity of it all. I can't picture anyone less. Unless, I guess one way to read McCarthy in a way is as like hardcore drag, right? He's just like, he's really committed to his one fucking persona. He's not going to keep putting on a different outfit. He's that guy. Yeah,
I sort of want him to be a little bit more like John Milius, the guy that wrote and directed Red Dawn. He wrote Apocalypse Now. He's this like gun-toting wild man that, we brought him up a bunch of times, or at least I have. He's who Walter from The Big Lebowski is based on. You almost want, John Milius had a twinkle in his eye when he's talking about apocalyptic death by, vintage 1911s and stuff like that, like, whereas, and I think that there's just not a twinkle in this late Cormac McCarthy's eye. Like, I would not even be able to guess whether or not a book after this would be great or not. Like, I don't know, like, who knows? I'm glad they exist.
Yeah.
Daniel, I'm curious about in the world of philosophy and rhetoric and books that you tend to focus on, if there are books in that field that you see as being akin to this sort of drone, but in the theoretical, because I think about, you're very focused on Deleuze and Guattari separately and together. And to me, like Thousand Plateaus is sort of both. It's this crazy anarchistic eclecticism, but simultaneously it's so dispersed and erratic that it's almost hypnotically droning.
Yeah, except they're so Baroque. I mean, they're so funny. There's such a humor, such a put on.
Yeah.
Right? They invent concepts, and people, I love looking at like the Twitters and being like, what do they mean by this? It's like, Jesus Christ, like they're just making shit up out their asses and seeing if it sticks, right? Like to them, each thing its own concept, right? Rather than seeking the Uber concept, right? And I love that play it's funny, I'm scanning my shelf now, but in fact, I just have a taste for the Baroque, which is so different than McCarthy, right? He really is that sort of one note. I think about, the only thing I can really think about looking at my shelf right now is someone like a Rigorei, who just, while there's a complexity of vision, of folds of vision, she has a kind of, like, again, I think actually a fair amount of the French feminist writers have more of a monotone, right? And where I mean, it does seem gendered at some point, where the men have such a freedom of the put on. It makes me actually wonder how that fits into the gender discourse, right? Like, why are men so Baroque, and the feminine tends towards the univocal, which is of course not universal, right? I mean, I'm a band I'm obsessed with, and I recently can't stop listening to a band called the Breeders. I listen to Kim Deal coming out of the Pixies, and the humor she shares with Frank Black, and the put on, which is so different than the sort of riot girl thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think I agree with this concept of the put on, although without leaning too heavily on gender essentializing ways of thinking about gender and artists, that the domain of the monotone, the platform of character-free minimalism has been the domain of straight white men almost solely. There are totally exceptions, but yeah, I think that's been a question that's been, rolling around for decades now, is this concept of like, Miguel Gutierrez posing the question, does abstraction belong to white people? It's a fair question.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah. My point is not to centralize it at all. It's really about a discourse. It's like who feels free to do the put on, right? Is the put on a site? I don't want to get into this because I don't have an answer, right? Is the put on a site of privilege, a site of I have the freedom to do all these things, right? So my point is not to centralize it at all. Yes. I'm just wondering why. Again, I'm just looking over my shelf as we're speaking right now, and her book jumped at me because I'm looking and I see Deleuze and Guattari, I see Kierkegaard, see Nietzsche, and they're all over the place, shifting tones, textures, modes, authorship, right? Such a play, such a put on. Foucault, such a play, such a put on. Burroughs, Nabokov, right? Just refusing to be any one voice, right? I think about Pale Fire, right? I can't picture a book less Cormac McCarthy than Pale Fire, or Borges, Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that's just my taste, of course. Yeah, there's something, again, I came back to the Gabriel Garcia Marquez, right? And Love in the Time of Cholera, which is not nihilistic. It's the opposite of nihilistic, but he kind of hits this one note. That's my memory. Fuck, I haven't read this book in 30 years. I wrote that recently to somebody asked me something, and I was like, well, I haven't read it in 30 years. It took me a minute to say that. And I was like, have I? Am I that fucking old?
Yeah, that happens.
God, that was a weird moment. 30 years since I read the book. But again, I what I like about Cormac McCarthy is precisely what I don't like about him.
I think I'm alongside you with that one. One philosopher that might be a good and might be slightly analogous is Emile Cioran, who
I think I
foisted him on you.
You did. And
where it's just
but he's so funny.
Books and books and books and books of bleak nihilistic aphorisms.
Yeah, except
one book is the same as the next, and they're all.
No, but he has such a joy. There's such a humor and such like this little. He'll smirk. He never just seems despairing. I was almost going to say him, but I feel like it's still, I think the closest thing when I look at my shelf again is a Rigorai or a Sisu who just hit this one note and follow it all the way,
Yeah. I mean, to me, when I think about like one note, possibly accomplished, mostly dreary, I just think about like secondary literature on Nietzsche. Like there's a lot of like really brilliant writing that's just flat. And I mean, I guess it's not brilliant at that point. Like that's the whole Schopenhauer thing. If you're not a stylist, you should just kick rocks. But there's a lot of secondary stuff out there. But if I wanted to get to like a monotone thing, think about like Stoicism. Like that shit, it's so popular right now, but it's very like, it's basically about developing a code and doing the right thing. And, it's very, I don't know, it's like life rejecting, but it definitely feels very stodgy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm curious how much McCarthy will shift. So there's definitely a shift in some literary technique between the two books I've read. So it'd be Blood Meridian and The Road.
Mm.
And I know T.C. Boyle, who, again, I know I could bring up some of you haven't read, who is an incredible yarn spinner, great prosist. He will purposely sort of shift tones. He has a great book about growing pot up in Marin, guy in San Francisco, called Budding Prospects, right? It shifts tone so dramatically from a book like East is East while still deploying the same vision. So looking at the move from Blood Meridian to The Road, he is playing with some rhythmic changes, with some stylistic shifts while still deploying a common vision. I'm wondering how varied his tone is. And I don't know, I ask you that, Chad.
I don't think it varies that much, to be honest. I think a better way of describing it would be it's becoming more and more refined. Like when you look at the earlier books, it's almost like he's like purging the influences out as he keeps going on. Like in the early days, it's very much like, like a Faulkner cover band. And, like I've said it 100 times on this episode along, like Blood Meridian's to me the high point. And then I don't think he's really hit anything that great since, although everything is really good. To me, it's like Radiohead. Like I don't often feel like putting on a Radiohead album, but every single one of them is great. I'm like, and they just become more of themselves. Like he's not really, I mean, no one's unaffected by other things. And he says it himself that it's based on what he's read, but like what he seems to have read based on his notes and his like personal papers is just, like late 19th. It's like all, Faulkner and Herman Melville is huge for him. The Bible is Defoe's Plague Years was an influence on this book. It's almost like his influences are so concretized and it's not wild or anything. I don't know. I mean, I definitely see your overall critique of it being kind of like one note. It's interesting to think about, especially with other writers that seem to switch around and change with the times.
What makes me, it's funny you brought up Radiohead. One thing I respect about Radiohead is actually they move around, surprisingly, right? While they're always being Radiohead. When I was reading this, when I read McCarthy, I actually think about Stereolab. It's like, God, I went through a big Stereolab phase. I was like, God, after they have like 47 records, and after like 2 or 3, it's like, do I need another Stereolab record? Can you even tell the fucking difference? They hit a note. And I can't imagine a note more different than Cormac McCarthy's in Stereolab, but it is a note, right? They're never going to shift and sound like death metal. They're not going to shift and sound like My Bloody Valentine, right? Or singer-songwritery, right? Where like even a Yola Tango who move, who always sound the same, actually shift. They play around a little bit. So back to you, Mark, where you were saying like who is this? Who mimics this, at least in philosophy and music? I think, your death metal bands are a good example, right? Of bands who just have a vision and fucking deploy it. right? It's just one note, and we're just going to nail this note over and over. Yeah, I think it becomes both a strength and not a weakness, but a limitation.
Oh, sure.
McCarthy wrote this really interesting, I guess it's not interesting, but I guess he helps his science friends copyright their papers that they submit. And he wrote kind of like a really good, kind of like a guide for copywriters, and I was thinking about when, like, in conversation, Daniel, I think you referred to him as a hack, which I know, I was thinking about like the idea of like what a hack writer actually, like somebody who's paid to write a specific thing, and because they don't love it, it kind of like doesn't matter so much, and like, which is basically my career, right? But you could be very good at that career.
Sure.
And I think that there's something like about that, like here, like he's just so, like, I was thinking about how he thinks there's a way of doing things. I feel like he might think that there is a way of writing a novel, and the stuff this is just what it is. Like if you were like a punk rocker and you're like, I fucking love the Misfits, your band's probably going to sound a little bit like the Misfits.
Right.
Yeah. I wonder, like, that chain of influence, if he, like, went back to the conversation about whether or not he had borrowed from Parable of the Sower. I'd be curious if he even read it, or if he even reads anything modern, or if he even reads novels.
He's so writerly, though. I mean, one of the most conspicuous things to me when I was first reading Blood Meridian, it's like, oh my God. Again, it felt like I was someone who came out of the Iowa program. Like, it was so writerly, where William Burroughs is not writerly at all, right? He's just shit spilling out of him. And that's why Burroughs will never be considered a serious writer, even though I think he's probably the greatest writer of the 20th century. Did things with sentences, though, and knows what to do with. McCarthy is functioning very much. He's very much in the New Yorker could publish all his chapters without batting.
Yeah. There's nothing like wild or offensive in his books,
right?
To go along with the comedy, and and not everything has to be that, I guess. But I know what you're saying. Like, I would probably, if I had to choose, I would rather be like a real deal agent of chaos whose whole life is on the table, like William Burroughs, than someone who is an in the shadows technician. Like, yeah,
he's a technician,
like McCarthy. Yeah,
he's a craftsman. And the fact is, I mean, God, at the time I got into a big fight with my then girlfriend because I kept wanting to read her these sentences from Blood Meridian, and I was so blown away by them. I kept wanting to read them out loud, and she did not want me to read them out loud, because he can craft a fucking sentence. And as a writer, I'm like, Jesus Christ, this guy can write. And his vocabulary, I mean, to me, it's like my brother always said about Nabokov. Nabokov is the only guy who would ever make him go to a dictionary. But I feel that way about McCarthy. I mean, his vocabulary so far exceeds my own. And his invocation of words, I simply do not know.
Yeah, I have a document of Cormac McCarthy words where when I get to one, I just like write it down, and then I'll usually look it up. The number of times like he like creates these verbs out of archaic nouns is really interesting. Like in The Road, he calls something "sepulchered," which I think is just really
amazing.
Like, to me, that's really Shakespearean, to completely create a neologism out of an existing word that's, not even easily understood. I think it's so badass. I mean, the other writer who's not nearly as good that I think does that really well is H.P. Lovecraft. Like, I think there's even like a book that's like the dictionary of Lovecraft. It's just all of his weird fucking words, like kind of collected together.
That's funny. Yeah.
Well, although I feel like Lovecraft was forced to do it by nature of the type of writer he is, because there are only so many words in the English language to describe the types of the type of world he was trying to create. So he almost had to, otherwise it would get very relentless.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's again what beguiles me in a way, and I keep coming back to this about someone like McCarthy, who has clearly this intelligence, clearly this craft, really an uncanny craft, and then to really have one insight over and over again, and that one insight is fucking the universe is brutal. And there's nothing else. He doesn't really give me insights about language the ways, let's say, Nabokov does. I mean, the way Nabokov is always writing about language. And, I always felt like that's what Lolita is really a book about, a mode of writing. or an insight like Burroughs, gives us so much complex insight into the relationship between the species and the molecular and the ethical and the historical and the intergalactic, and he's constantly reading the world at all these different levels. McCarthy has this one way he reads the world. He only sees one thing, and there's something so impressive about that. And then I'm like, dude, I wish you could use this craft to other ends.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of like that Thomas Aquinas thing, where it's like, something like the man who's read one book deeply is better than the man who's read a bunch of books shallowly, which parallels to the Bruce Lee quote about, I fear the man who's practiced one kick 1,000 times, not the man who's practiced 1,000 kicks. So there's something about that there. I'm just glad there's a bunch of different books to read.
Yeah. And power to it. Like I love that I'm not stuck just with McCarthy, because I can read his one tone and I can jump around and read other things. Like I don't need him.
Yeah, it's up to you to build the organ of your bookshelf,
Yeah, exactly. Which again, I respect. It's just it stops me from falling short of loving him, even while I tore through these books and enjoyed reading them.
That's like I wouldn't describe him as my favorite author of all time, even though Blood Meridian is my favorite book of all time.
Okay.
And sometimes people are like, that doesn't make any sense. It seems like that should line up. And we're like, well, not really. Like my favorite author is Mark Twain. And you see what you're talking about in Mark Twain. There's like the humor and the wildness.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a play. I mean, just the put on, the play, the goof, the love of language, the love of ideas, the love, right? Plays all over the place. But yeah, I mean, the fact is, in preparing for this podcast, I have cried more intensely. I mean, I cried with some frequency, but I cried harder than I've cried in a long time.
You're welcome.
I mean, watching that movie, I think, I was hysterical, just hysterical, which I love. I relish that. What a treat, to be able to have that resonance in my body. So again, I know I keep sounding critical, but it's also, I want to temper that with all the pleasure I got from it. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yep.
Is McCarthy still around? Is he still alive? Do we know what's up?
Alive.
Do we know what to expect from the man? I'm sure he's not sending chapters to the New Yorker on a regular basis, but
I feel like I read somewhere a long time ago that he's still got one book kind of cooking that, like, it's not, he's not really saying it's his last book or anything like that, but he's got something on the horizon because he has a couple like unpublished screenplays. There's a one called like Whales and Men or something like that. It's supposed to be very Melvillian. I've never even heard of it outside of that book about McCarthy that I read. There's usually like quite a bit of space in between his books, but there wasn't much space between like No Country Old Men and The Road kind of came out right after each other, and then Sunset Limited was right after that.
There's a movie, Sunset Limited?
HBO did one, I know.
Huh.
It's Tommy Lee Jones, right? And
yeah, it's okay. Yeah, it came out in like 2011.
I never watched it.
A Cormac McCarthy original screenplay just seems like something that I would be so afraid it would just get fucked up. And it seems that Hollywood is far more eager to do remakes, reboots of mediocrity than it is to revisit movies that it completely fucked up the first time around,
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate.
He has such like, it's like you can only get away with not being a hipster doing this when you're very old. Like, he's written every single thing on a 1963 Olivetti typewriter.
Oh,
all right.
Jesus.
Oh my God, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I think about that. Like, I remember like the Kerouac thing about, the typewriter has its own rhythm, man.
Oh yeah,
I
Burroughs.
Yeah. One of them said, probably Burroughs or somebody
remember
said it.
that becomes a whole thing in Naked Lunch. Remember which writer?
Yeah.
In the movie, they keep it like he takes the other guy's typewriter, takes Paul Bowles' typewriter, and has his own thing. I first came to San Francisco. I was obsessed with that, and I went out to some used place way out. I just moved here. I was crashing at a friend's house in the lower Haight. Found a typewriter at some shop way out in the Sunset. I don't even know how I got out there. And I would only write on a typewriter for a year before I realized that was idiotic because I don't even know how to fucking type.
Yeah, it's terrible. Writing on a typewriter is awful. I mean,
Brutal.
I think everybody tries. Everybody who like fancies themselves a writer, especially if you have certain taste, at some point you're like, gotta get back to the basics, man.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I mostly write by hand. Even for work, I do a lot of writing in notebooks and stuff like that.
I do too. I do too. Yeah, my clients are always surprised that I have a pad and paper. I never take notes. I never take notes on the computer. That's for the document. My notes are on pen and paper. But it does speak to McCarthy's thing, which is always that he does have this sort of that beat sensibility of the real thing, of something more honest, something more true. In ethics, it's just true. Do we eat people? No, Dad. No, we don't eat people. You promise we don't eat people? No, we don't eat people. Some of those exchanges between the father and son on the road, I kind of wanted to bitch slap them both, like just enough with this super simplistic enunciation of an ethic that's just true. That was the most painful part of reading that book to me. You know what I'm talking about? That
Oh yeah,
it just keeps coming back, and I'm like, oh yeah,
it's really brassy in the film, I think, because like kid actors, it's always tough. Like that kid's a better actor than I'll ever be, so it's hard to levy criticism on him. But he's still a child actor, and they're almost always terrible. I mean, you got to be like some sort of mutant, I think, to not be awful.
Yeah,
and it just, especially when you're trying to say something like pretty heavy.
Right.
Like I feel like a better way to portray that kid would have been just like all quiet, like a child soldier.
Yep. Yeah, it was the one thing they couldn't do. And that's what Mark was saying sort of about Vigo, that he has a humanity, right? He's not just a soldier. And I think that's the Hollywood interpretation of this book, right? They can't help but inflect it through the human. You got an actor, you got a character. That's why I think McCarthy works better on the written page, right? Because there is an inhumanity to it.
Yeah, like people talk about like how Blood Meridian's unfilmable or whatever. And I remember like when this was coming out, people were talking about how unfilmable this would be. And I kind of disagree. I mean, it really, like John Hillcoat it is as it sounds in the book. Like everything is like, even the dialogue is like straight from the book. Things happen exactly the way they do in the book, even to a fault. But you don't get to imagine the tone, the raspiness of the kid, a starved kid. And, and then film, as much as it is amazing, it really is mostly visual and auditory. Whereas when you're reading a book, if you have an imagination, you're crafting this world in your head. So like the smells of the bodies inside the basement of the house where the cannibals are, like that's not something that comes across in film. But when you're reading a book, you really imagine it.
You're right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I was, again, I know we keep saying this, I was impressed with the movies, how un-Hollywood in so many ways. Like it was so Hollywood compared to the book, but so un-Hollywood in so many other ways. I was impressed that they really forged ahead with that. Like I think they shied away from making a great film, but they still went a slightly odd direction, for Hollywood,
Yeah, I feel like that might be like that John Hillcoat's Australian. Like there's a lot of these weird movies made by like Australians and New Zealanders that are just, they feel Hollywood, but they're just off a little bit.
It makes sense. I didn't realize he was Australian. That makes sense why what's his face is the father at the end, the man who comes to him, right?
Yeah, and he plays the lead in Hillcoat's Proposition, which I love the Propositions.
I've seen the Proposition. Yeah.
Nick Cave wrote it, did the soundtrack, and then he also, I think the last movie that Hillcoat did was, I think it was Lawless, which is that like bootlegger movie with Tom Hardy, which is another movie that just has like weird beats and doesn't really go the way you think it's going to go, but it's also kind of just like an old, it's worth a watch. Like Tom Hardy's totally watchable. And then Guy Pearce has a very creepy lawman character that's pretty good.
I was very surprised to see Guy Pearce at the end of that film. I was like, is that him? Is that fucked up looking face? Guy Pearce?
Yeah.
He's one of my favorite guys. I mean, Vigo and him on the same scene. I'd rather see them together. I know they didn't actually share the screen, but those are two great.
Robert Duvall's kind of a beautiful cameo as well.
Always Robert Duvall, right? I mean, I think the movie works in a lot of ways between that palette, fucking Vigo's face, right? You believe him. You always believe him. And I agree with Mark that he adds a level of humanity. But I think that was very hard to do. I can't imagine an actor in the Hollywood repertoire who could portray an inhumanity. They would have had to go somewhere very different.
Oh, for sure. So what have we learned?
What have we learned? What have we learned?
Definitely get more ammo. 2 bullets is not enough.
2 bullets is not enough. You gotta, or know how to carve the fake ones. Yeah, I think there's, maybe it's about just the despair in the end. It's just, what are you going to do except embrace it? Which I don't think he does. I think that's something missing from The Road, right? There's no Buddhist affirmation of death, right? It's despair, which is what's interesting about it actually is that he takes on the sort of the radical indifference of the cosmos, of the earth itself, and yet the despair is so human. There's no joy in it. There's no affirmation of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's no, there's no resolve there except, we're facing our own apocalypse, and I say there's better ways to go out than McCarthy is proffering.
Yeah, we're facing the apocalypse, and I guess we can all just expect a nice family unit will come and save us.
Yeah, fucking A, right? I keep looking down the road, see these families walk with their mask. I'm going to jump out and see if they'll adopt me. The other side of this, which, of this apocalypse is the path I think a lot of us are taking. I just saw what's her name? The orchid woman, Susan Orleans, were all over Twitter, owning up to her just drinking relentlessly during the plague, and that's definitely been my approach. I mean, I'm drug addled, and in fact, I've had to dial it down because I'm like, this isn't sustainable. I didn't realize I had to keep going. I thought I had to just go through a few months of this. I was like, fuck, yeah. I'm going to wake up dead one morning.
I think this has been actually the most productive time in my life.
Oh, wow.
And also, I have never consumed more drugs and alcohol in my life either. It's kind of both. Yeah. It's just this extreme time of intense boredom and productivity and haze.
Right. Yeah. Well, you left out to me despair, which is
I'm not there. I'm not.
Yeah,
despairing.
It's funny. I don't think
I'm doing fine. I'm so thankful. I'm doing all right.
I don't think I realized the level of my despair until I realized I was deep into my regime and realized it wasn't sustainable. I was beginning to fall apart. I think it came actually watching The Road, where I'm crying hysterically, and I realized how emotionally strung out I was. Through all these ups and downs of a very elaborate drug regime. And for all those listening, it's an all legal drug regime. It's all legal. Don't come knocking down my door. Yeah, fucking A.
Yeah, I've basically been on mushrooms for 3 weeks straight.
Oh. Is that true?
Yeah. I took a bunch of mushrooms when I started this podcast.
So, Chad, did you want to say any last little?
Well, I mean, that's pretty much it for me, man. Like, I liked this book quite a bit. I love Blood Meridian. If anybody wants to DM us on Instagram to talk about either of those things forever, I'm totally into it. Yeah. And then, for Blood Meridian, I don't know if he started it or done it, but our buddy Dominic, Literary Libations, I think he's rebranded it to something else recently. But he's got some sort of Blood Meridian reading group that would be kind of fun. If you guys are interested, just message us and I'll get that to you, the info.
And you can message us at whatthe@scarythoughts.org. And in fact, reach out to us, talk about anything you like. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us again. That was fantastic and made digging into it really satisfying. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, likewise. That helped me a lot. So thank you always, both, truly, deeply.
You too. All right, everybody, stay healthy.
All right.
Keep everyone else in your life healthy. Thanks for listening.
I don't know if we want to stop the podcast or not.